dia. Então, a gente está aqui com o professor Julian Novak. Eu vou passar agora para o inglês, mas no Zoom a gente tem tradução. Então, quem precisar é só usar a tradução do inglês para o português. E aí as perguntas também vão ficar no final, e também, se vocês quiserem, vocês podem fazer em português no chat, que a gente depois pergunta para ele. Então, we are delighted to welcome today Professor Julian Novak. Professor Novak is a leading authority in competition law and policy, serving as associate professor at both Hong Kong University and Lund University in Sweden. He also sits on the board of the Journal of Antitrust Enforcement. Beyond his academic credentials, which include a master's degree and a doctorate from the University of Oxford, as well as an LLM in European Legal Studies from Durham University, what truly distinguishes Professor Novak is his creative and innovative scholarship. His research explores cutting-edge topics in antitrust, such as algorithmic predation and the intersection between sustainability and competition. It is on this latter theme that he will speak to us today. This is not only a matter of academic debate, as highlighted in the recent judgment concerning the soil moratorium agreements. As we saw in the last week's session, the subject is highly controversial. While no one questions the importance of sustainability and its impact on consumer welfare, the real challenge lies in determining how to integrate environmental concerns into antitrust analysis. This is precisely the question Professor Novak will address in his presentation. We thank him warmly for being with us. We are also grateful to Commissioner Victor Fernandes and the International Unit of CAT, represented by Otávio Augusto Cruz Filho, whose support made this seminar possible. We will have time, as I said, we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. Professor Novak.
Great, thanks, and thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have the chance to present my book. I'll talk a bit about the book. So the whole thing, the book should be coming out, or is maybe already out in the UK. I just got the confirmation of shipment of 6 copies to my office. So it might be out or about to come out in the next couple of days. It's a project that started off in 2020 when I was asked to write a report for the OECD, and I looked around the world and all these kind of different cases, and I thought, well, actually, there's so much more to say than I did in the OECD report, and so much more cases that I could look into. So I said, let me write this book. And the plan was to basically finish it, I think I started it mid-2020, and I wanted to finish it by end of 2020, but then I had a child, our first child during the pandemic, and then I went on parental leave, so it got pushed back, and then by the time I came out of parental leave, there was so much happening. There were guidelines, draft guidelines here, draft guidelines there, and I was like, oh, I need to do some catch-up. And then I did some catch-up, and things dragged on, and new proposals came, so I had to incorporate them all, and then I moved to Hong Kong, and I was just about to submit the book, and the university said to me, well, it's always better if you start at a new place and the book comes out when you're starting at a new place. So I was like, okay, I can wait with the last corrections, and then there came some more guidelines. I said, okay, that gives me the chance to incorporate them, and then it comes out when I'm in Hong Kong. So now it's finally out, or out soon. What I'll do today is I'll talk to you about the book. I know that there is a soil moratorium, but I'll not lecture you on Brazilian competition law. I don't know much about Brazilian competition law. However, and that was like also something that I only realized when I came here, and then we realized that the soil moratorium case is on. There are some similarities to one of the examples that I have in the book, but I'm not going to talk about it in details. And that's actually something that I start with. It just highlights the sustainability competition angle, which is a practical example, not from Brazil, but something rather similar, the Indonesian palm oil pledge. So in 2014, at the United Nations Climate Summit, it was signed by the world's biggest palm oil producers, and they basically said, we're not going to buy palm oil from newly deforested land. There was a bit of a question to the competition authority whether that was okay. The competition authority said, well, we don't see any major problems at the moment. And there was also an announcement by the Association of Small Landholders. They also said, oh, that's actually something very nice. We like that. We are very happy with that. There was afterwards, there was some political pressure by the big palm oil producers in Indonesia. Indonesia, palm oil is one of the main exports. And after that political pressure, the competition authorities started an investigation and said, well, let's look into this again. And that basically scared off these palm oil buyers and producers. And they basically said, well, we're not going to have the palm oil pledge anymore. And I think it just like nicely highlights, as does the case here, the possible tension between competition law, sustainability, political pressure, major producers, minor producers, environmental NGOs, and so on. So that's just an example. That's not the only one. Oh yes, there's also another funny part of the anecdote, which is that after this standard was abolished, the state adopted basically a standard that copy and pasted the rules that were already in this palm oil pledge and replaced it. I have talked to a friend of mine from Indonesia, and I asked him, so what is the status of this standard and its enforcement? And he said to me, look, Julian, in Indonesia we have a saying, what happens in the jungle stays in the jungle. So to what extent this is enforced or not, that is only clear in the jungle. So maybe that also resonates in Brazil. But it's not only headlines, there are tons of headlines. So these are some older ones. Larry Fink back in 2020 said, well, all companies that BlackRock invests in need to do something about sustainability or climate change in particular. Glencore joined a mining compact not to buy conflict minerals in the DRC. There was the Association of Truck Makers in Europe that says we're going to phase out the diesel cars. There was the DOJ then who launched an investigation. That was the first Trump term against car producers that said we're going to voluntarily comply with the Californian standard and not produce cars with different standards for different parts of the US. There is Climate 100 Action, which now somehow is also linked to this BlackRock situation where they all, these investors said, we want to do something about climate change, and that is also now challenged as a kind of anti-ESG challenge by some state attorneys in the United States based on antitrust grounds, but also on fiduciary duty grounds. I'm not 100% clear. I really understand the antitrust theory of harm there, but yes. And then there was also the car emissions cartel in Europe, and I'll come back to that. So things are happening in this space quite a lot. What will I try to talk about today is the following. I'll first talk a bit about sustainability, just to get you up to speed. Then about one of the questions that we all wonder, should competition law care about sustainability? Then a bit about the economics of competition, sustainability, and how they interact. Then a framework to think about this sustainability competition law nexus. Then the core questions, and then a bit closer a look into substantive and procedural questions of competition law. Good. So what is sustainability? I'll go through that one rather quickly. Environmental sustainability, we typically start with that. There are a couple of major challenges that we face in that regard. Obviously, climate change, then biodiversity loss, land use change, deforestation. Land use change is not only deforestation, it's also kind of turning farmland into cities. Concrete essentially replaces land. Then pollution, chemical pollution, plastic waste. Think about the microplastics that we are all having in our bodies. What was I reading? That if you cut open our brains these days, there's about like 1 spoonful of microplastics or nanoplastics in our brain, and we all consume about the size of a credit card per year in plastics. So those are kind of general environmental sustainability questions. We then can also talk about the social sustainability, and I think that also is something that in Brazil might be much more important, where developing countries might be focused much more on the sustainability, social sustainability side. That's poverty, access to basic service, water, sanitation, food, healthcare, education, the marginalization and discrimination of certain groups, women, children, minorities, which are basically prevented from accessing and participating in the society in the same way. And then social cohesion and justice. Post-conflict societies, post-conflict areas are typically even worse affected, also of the environmental problems. Uneven distribution of the environmental burdens. It's typically not the rich people that live next to the trash site. It's something else. So I think what it all comes down is this famous connection between the environmental, the social, and the economic dimension of sustainability. And that can basically be put together in these three different ways. I think they nicely incorporate that. So one on the top right corner is the idea that environment sets the outer boundaries, and within it the society and the economy develop. The other idea to say, look, what is sustainable is where the social, the economic, and the environment overlap. And then the other one says, well, we have these different pillars of sustainability, and they are all kind of equal, and together they build sustainability. But that's just like the theory around it. There's also kind of legal stuff around sustainability. Most importantly, the UN Resolution 70/1, which sets out the SDGs, the Social Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals with 169 associated targets. So that's just basic sustainability and to get to you. So the question then becomes, should competition law care about sustainability? And I think there we first need to acknowledge that this is a normative question. It's a question about should, not does it. It's should we, are we ought to, do we have to do that? And I think we all have our ideas about this. Those are kind of general concerns and arguments. One is it's a moral imperative. We need to consider our impact on the environment, on other people, and so on. There's the idea that this is a value judgment. How do we balance competition and sustainability? And that this is not the expertise of competition agencies, so maybe we shouldn't be doing that. And overall, it's political choices, and the political branch is much better equipped to do that. And I think they're all kind of very important arguments, and they show our leanings. And they help us understand the debate and the arguments that are going into one way or the other. But so those are kind of the underlying arguments, concerns that come in. But I think as a lawyer, and in the end I'm a lawyer, my starting point is the law. And if it's a normative question, should we, then a lawyer answers typically a normative question, should we do something or not? Lawyers always give the same answer, right? They say it depends. And my law teacher at the beginning, I think in the third semester, told me the difference between a lawyer and a good lawyer is that the good lawyer tries to tell you what does it depend on, and I'll try to tell you that, so I try to be a good lawyer then. So one of the things is international law. Are there international law obligations, and to what extent are they binding under national law? The status under national law is different depending on the country that you are in. So if you are in a monist state like the Netherlands, every international law that the Netherlands sign up to is directly binding in the Netherlands, while other states are dualist countries, states where there first needs to be a parliamentary act that says this international law is binding within our state. So that's one question. The other one is constitutional obligation. Switzerland, Mexico, Russia, there's Article 11, I'll talk about that, and 39 in the EU that impose some obligations, and I'll talk about 39, Article 11 TFEU as an example, because that was also something that I've done in my PhD, which I started in 2008. So then sometimes when I say that, I realize how long I have been doing this stuff, and I feel old. So that is the other side, like how do constitutional obligations tell us to what do we need to do? And the third one is the aims and provisions of competition law. Some competition laws say, well, we are here to foster the development of the country. So their sustainable development nicely fits into the provisions of the law, and there might be other rules in the laws, and we come to that, maybe public interest provisions, specific provisions about environmental protection and so on. They change the outcome to this question. So that's just a kind of general, I think, my take on should competition law care about sustainability. Good. So let's look into this example, and a constitutional obligation and in the EU context. So here we have Article 11 and Article 37 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. They all read like the Charter of Fundamental Rights. It's very slightly different, but the basic principle is the same. Environmental protection requirements must be integrated into the definition and implementation of the Union's policies and activities, in particular with a view to promoting sustainable development. So that's what it says, which then leads us to, first of all, identify that's an obligation. So when I did my research on this article during my PhD, I went to the drafting of this article and how it changed over time, and how the drafters basically said this is an obligation that applies to all areas of activity of the Union, and they underlined all in the drafts. So in that sense, it's an obligation to integrate environmental conservations. Well, it doesn't tell us how does that work? What does that mean in practice? It just tells us that we have to do it. And it can basically, I think for competition, or that's how at least I have construed it, mean two things. We can try to prevent conflict between environmental protection, social sustainability and competition rules, and we can try to solve conflicts. For example, we can balance, and we'll come back to that. Where are the limits? The limits are obviously interpretation of the law. I cannot change the law. I'm not the parliament, or in this case the treaty members of the EU, that they can only change the treaty. So it's the wording essentially, and as interpreted by the Court of Justice. So you can play around within these limits, but there are limits. More importantly, the EU Court said this obligation also applies to competition law, and it's a stronger obligation than, for example, with regard to sports, because it says, oh, the EU, sports is also an important area for the EU, and that has been decided in the recent Super League case, where they distinguished the sports situations from the environmental and some other obligations that are imposed on the EU. So that gives you a bit of an example of what we are doing. So I suppose there will be some economists here, and you can then correct me where I'm wrong. I tried to look into these things a bit. So if we are thinking about economics, competition and sustainability, what can we say? Well, first of all, I think we can identify a certain overlap there. The overlap first is that if you are increasing your efficiency, resource efficiency, that is productive efficiency, that is sustainable. If you're producing the same amount with less, that's very sustainable. The other part is dynamic efficiency. The idea that sustainability is a quality element, and that then innovation to improve the status quo in terms of sustainability is important. And it's also kind of, if you go back to the sustainability goals in the UN SDGs, they say, well, sustainable innovation is one of the things that we need to do. And they also call on business to improve and foster sustainable innovation. I think competition lawyers and economists all agree, and I agree to that. Ideally, we want to achieve that by regulation. This is the best tool to do that. That would be the number one thing. If we then look out into what's out there in terms of studies, economic studies, we can see that there are actually some empirical studies. Some say, well, more competition leads to improvements in sustainability. Others say, well, sustainability is a public good, or most of the times it's a public good, and then competition can also be bad. So it's a mixed picture. So if we then take a step back and say, oh, okay, this is what we observe. What about the theory? Theory is also a bit mixed. I think there's a good argument by Martin Peter Schinkel. He said, where consumers value sustainability, competition is typically better at delivering it. Obviously, then companies are competing on sustainability parameters and will deliver what the consumer wants. That's, I think, a very good starting point for any competition authority. However, the situations are slightly different. So if companies get together and there is one company, the assumption in Martin Peter Schinkel's paper are the very kind of standard assumptions, rationality of consumers, consumers care, and so on. And I have more on that in the book. I try to summarize all of this and a couple more. But Indes says, look, if you change it here slightly, where one of the companies that is involved in an agreement like this cares about, and he takes the example of emissions, not only its own emissions, but the emissions of the industry, that changes the outcome slightly, and in those cases, cooperation might be better than competition. There are other cases which talk about the first mover disadvantage, Praha, but that's a fancy term, I think, just to say we're talking about free riding. People are not making the investment because they are concerned that others will free ride on their investment. Classical examples are, if I'm going to educate how my product is more sustainable and consumers might not really care yet, then I'll have to invest a lot in advertisement, in educating the consumers, and the second mover can then move ahead rather quickly because the consumers already care about sustainable and they just need to make their product more sustainable. They don't need to also invest in advertisement. So that's one example, but there are others. So that's first mover disadvantage, free riding. But I think in competition economics we are rather familiar with the idea of free riding. So that's I think with the study. So my takeaway, and I was redrafting this when I came here. So my usual takeaway is consumers drive sustainability with competition if consumers care. But I thought I'm coming here to Brazil, which is a developed country and a developing country at the same time. It sits in the middle. So I put this one there, and I said, like, in developing countries where consumers drive sustainability because they demand it, it's a good starting point. But if we are taking then these kind of models and trying to apply them, I think we need to look into the relevance of the assumptions in individual cases. So what about the demand of consumers, their willingness to pay? Maybe they are willing to pay. Maybe there are biases, so even they are willing to pay. Like me, I'm a person of great contradictions. I think I'm a bit of a hypocrite. I fly around the world to teach you about sustainability. It's slightly hypocritical, but I do care about it. So usually if I go out into the supermarket, I go and buy the more sustainable option. But if I'm in a bit of a hurry, I'm just going to look for the cheapest one and grab it and run out. So those are kind of the biases I think we can think about, and we need to do that. And then, because it runs faster than I want, then I think the observability and comparability of the parameters for the consumers is important. So if the consumers care, they need to know and being able to compare the different products in terms of sustainability. If that's not possible, then competition cannot really drive it. And then the firm's motivation to profit maximization is also something we need to keep in mind. And I think that's the right starting point for our standard model. But not all markets are run by profit-maximizing firms. I don't know about Brazil, but in the US and the EU, UK, you have B Corps, you have even charities that are active in the market, so they might have different motivations. They might not put profit maximization there. So I think then we need to think about whether the models are really working in the same way. So, but in general, I think if sustainability is a quality parameter, we can think about dynamic competition, which then tells us that we can think about all the kind of innovation literature, innovation and competition literature, and then we can think about the inverted U shape, where too much competition is bad for innovation, also for sustainable innovation, and too little is also bad for innovation. So too little competition means that there's not going to be any innovation, no sustainable innovation, and too much competition as well. So those are the key takeaways that I would say are there. So that then brings me about thinking about sustainability and competition law in a competition nexus, the kind of framework to think about that. And that's what I develop a bit in the book, and I have developed that also before. So first of all, a competition authority can be an enabler of private sustainability action. So I call that supportive integration. It's essentially when private businesses do something for sustainability and the competition authority engages with that and thinks, well, is that legal or is that illegal? Maybe I can do something, interpret the law in a certain way that makes it possible for this to go ahead. And the other one is where the competition authority acts as a guardian of sustainability by fostering sustainability, by enforcing the competition law. And I think my colleague Simon Holmes has used these kind of two metaphors to build up on this framework. It says, on the one hand, you have the sword, where you use competition law as a sword, you enforce competition law, and that basically brings about the competition, and the competition then leads to more, more sustainability. And the other one is where private companies use sustainability or their sustainability actions, trying to use that as a shield in the context. If you see at this slide, I think you look at it and you might think, oh, Julian, why does it look so strange there that one is underlined and the other one is a bit smaller? I think it highlights, and that's basically a reminder to me to tell you, we sometimes in this debate focus only on the first one. This is not the majority of the cases. The sword cases are not the majority of the cases. And I think competition authorities also prefer to talk about the guardian situation because they can do something. In reality, we talk more about the shield situation, I think for two reasons. First, industry loves to talk about how good they are. And I think going back to what I said about economics, I think we should be a bit skeptical if they are claiming that. Especially if they are for-profit maximizing companies. So that is one, but it's also us lawyers and economists. We love a debate. And what is better than to debate something that is really topical? And that's why we're mainly talking about these kind of part, the shield part. But I'll talk about both of them, a bit about the sword and then a bit about the shield. So in general, however, the core question and the problem is always the same. Do we need to translate sustainability into competition law terms, into economic terms? Or maybe we don't need to do that. If we have a public policy exception, then you might say, oh, this is sustainability, this is competition, and we just do this, and it's all good. So then we don't need to translate it into economic terms. And the second one is then questions, how do we translate it into the language of competition law? We can think about, is it a restriction of competition? We can think about, is it efficiencies like innovation, quality kind of. There are other elements in the legal framework, like the state action defense that might come in and say, oh, you were forced to act in a certain way, so that's why competition law is not there. But those are the kind of questions we need to think about. So if we are now looking into the substantive law questions, with that, we can first look into the kind of situation of the sword. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So first of all, again, to highlight this, maintaining competition in these situations fosters sustainability. And you're using essentially competition law, enforced competition law, to make sure that competition can deliver sustainability. The common ground here, I think, that all competition lawyers can accept is mergers that reduce competition in relevant industries. There is a case from batteries in the United States. That was like an old case, but we can think about that same now, how important batteries are in the transition. It's an old case where the argument was, look, you're reducing competition on batteries with this merger, and these batteries are very important, not for sustainability purposes, but for our emergency services because they power our walkie-talkies for the police and the first responders. There's also cartel cases. A French hardwood flooring case is one case, and there are a couple of others now in France and Italy. France has also one about bisphenol A. This is one of these kind of things that we assume, or like there's evidence that creates that this is it's too fast for me. So that bisphenol A has these kind of properties that are acting like a hormone in our bodies. So there's a case about that, and there was recently another case about additives to fuel in Italy. So hardwood flooring case and the other two, they always work in the same way. So these are essentially situations where companies get together, in this case hardwood flooring companies, and say, look, we don't want anyone to talk about sustainability aspects of their product to consumers. When you're doing advertisement to the consumers, we're not going to mention how good or how bad one of the product is versus the other one. It's not that, oh, we are using only kind of sustainable product. That's not what we're going to talk. We talk about price, durability. Those are the things that we want to highlight in our advertisement, but not what chemicals we use or whether one chemical is better than the other. No, that's not what we do in our line of work, and that's what the French Competition Authority said. You stopped competing about the sustainability parameter in competition. You basically took away the opportunity from consumers to demand more sustainable hardwood flooring, and they find that as a cartel. So that's the common ground, and then we can start to think about how we can push the boundaries in terms of sustainability and in terms of using competition law to foster sustainability. One of the things is you have seen in the EU where they used a separate innovation theory of harm. So one is the Dieselgate cartel, but it basically goes also, and I think it was the first time in Bayer and Monsanto, where they said, look, we are not going to translate what we usually do, or innovation harms, into price harms. And I give you the Dieselgate AdBlue case, was that the companies agreed not to compete on being cleaner in cleaning of diesel cars, the exhaust that comes out of the back. They had a standard setting kind of thing. They all got together and wanted to make sure that people all got the same nozzle for the filling of AdBlue. AdBlue is this thing that you fill for diesel cars, and that helps in cleaning the exhausts. And they wanted to make sure that the nozzle for this tank is the same size, and that's what they all standardized. But they also then said, no, let's not move beyond that. We have agreed on this, and we're not going to try to get better at it. And the Commission said, we don't care, or we don't need to show that this leads to price increases or so on. It's enough that you have agreed not to compete on innovating more here. So that's something that is new and pushes the boundaries. Has also happened the same in Bayer Monsanto, where they basically examined whether innovation itself would be harmed. And then you can try, and in some jurisdictions that might be easier than in other jurisdictions, try to push the boundaries even further. For example, you can talk about innovation diversity in mergers. That was a critique of the Bayer Monsanto case. So innovation diversity in this case, think about Bayer Monsanto was about crop protection, right? And the idea here was Bayer and Monsanto, they all use chemicals to protect the crops. And the idea here was, well, have you also looked into different ways to protect crops? Are you maybe killing ways where you use other insects to target the insects in this crop area? And maybe there are different paths to get rid of insects that are pests that are harmful for the crop. And one way to get there is via insects that eat those pests, and the other one is to just spray pesticides. And the argument here would be to say, oh, this merger might be harmful in the sense that it leads and it deletes one of these pathways to the goal of controlling these pests. It only now will, after the merger, we'll only see the chemical one, and the other one is basically eliminated. That would be something to think about, innovation diversity. And then exploitative abuses, practices, maybe farmers, poverty and so on. Maybe that's an abuse. It depends a bit, I think, on the legal framework where you can do that or not. In the EU, I would be skeptical, maybe, but it's certainly not so easy. You're trying to push the boundaries in that regard. So now that was the sword. Let's go to the stuff that everyone discusses, the shield. And in the shield, I typically distinguish between scope and balancing, and I'll come back to that. So essentially the question here is always, is competition law an obstacle to companies doing something sustainable? And we first need to ask ourselves, do we need to balance sustainability and competition, or do we not? And sometimes we don't have to balance sustainability and competition, because we need to ask ourselves, is it within the scope of competition law? Because not every restriction of commercial freedom is also a restriction of competition. The idea being every contract restricts your commercial freedom that you sign, but they are not restrictions of competition itself. There is something more to restriction of competition. And then the second step was, once you have identified that there is a restriction, you can think about balancing, and then we can talk about what kind of balancing it is. And this is where it gets occasionally, but not always, controversial. So, what is outside the scope? And I'll mention a couple and then I'll focus on a couple of things a bit more in detail, questions about scope. So first of all, in the EU and Australia, for example, only commercial activities are within the scope of competition law. In the EU, it's called undertaking. You need to be an undertaking, engage in economic activity, otherwise you're not subject. You have certain sectoral exemptions in the US. I don't know how it is in Brazil, where competition law doesn't apply in the agricultural sector. The EU has now slightly changed the rules as well, so competition law there applies differently than usual. Then you have these kind of state action, state compulsion cases. The US car emissions case that I mentioned at the very beginning is something that might fall into this category, where there was an investigation started into these companies that said we're going to voluntarily comply with the stricter Californian standard, but then in the end they dropped the case, most likely because they saw that there's a very strong defense under the US state action defense, because it was a state standard. It wasn't set by the companies. And in the EU, you have something similar, state compulsion, where if the state requires you to act in a certain way and you don't have an opportunity to act in any other way, then that could also be not be subject to competition law. So those are kind of general things, and now I think it gets a bit more interesting. So first of all, there are a couple of cases where competition authorities have found there is no restriction of competition. One in the EU already goes back to the 90s. There were a couple of cases with cars and others about improving their emissions for cars. They said we're going to I think 1990, we're going to reduce emissions by 20%. That's the whole of the industry, car producers. And the Commission said, oh yes, there could be a restriction of competition, but actually it's not, because they have only set the target. How they are going to get there, whether they're going to make their cars more efficient by reducing the weight, having better engines, different engines, that's still up to competition. There is no real restriction of competition. The yogurt packaging case in the UK is a similar kind of idea. Their supermarkets get together and said, we want to change the way that yogurt packaging works. We want to reduce the impact of plastic packaging and so on. And the competition authority said, oh yes, you're doing this all together, but let's look at the price. This packaging actually has not really a big impact on the price that the consumers pay, so we don't really see any impact on competition here. The Netherlands says where you are having an agreement to comply with local laws, there you also don't see an impact on competition. There's no restriction of competition because you're just competing legally, and what they call that illicit competition, so competition that would actually be prohibited, and they said that's not a restriction of competition because that's not legal competition. We only protect legal competition. The EU has something similar. They say if you make an agreement to comply with binding international or EU law, that's also not a restriction of competition. And then there comes standard setting. That might also not be a restriction of competition in the sense that we think about it, but that comes with a number of conditions, typically, because standard setting is something that we usually like. We usually give standards a bit of a free ride, an easy ride, and say, well, standards are actually very important for innovation purposes, for informing consumers and so on, except where this leads to exclusion or cartels. Then we are not getting so easy on them. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. So sustainability standards are addressed in the Japanese guidelines. They basically say standards don't have an effect on competition if they don't have an arrangement on selling prices. They have no exclusion of competing specifications, no unreasonable expansions of the scope of the specifications, and I think they basically take that all here from the traditional approach on IT standards. An unreasonable exclusion of technology proposals, and no restraints on the participation in the standardization activity, plus no patent ambush. So that's, I think, what the Japanese say in terms of sustainability. Standards very much still influenced by the approach that we usually take to IT standards. The EU has thought a bit longer about this and adjusted their conditions as well, and they say there's a soft safe harbor. So in other words, if you're fulfilling these conditions, then you're extremely unlikely to restrict competition. First of all, you must have an open and transparent process in how you adopt the standard. Participation needs to be voluntary, meaning no participant is forced by the participants to join the standards. There must be the freedom to go beyond the standard, especially if you think about sustainability. That's very important. So it only sets the minimum standard. Everyone needs to be able to over-comply and say, oh, look, this is the standard, but I'm better. So that's an important point. They said there need to be limits on information changing, only what is objectively necessary for developing and applying the standard. So if you are exchanging pricing information, then you are talking about a hardcore cartel. That's not a standard. And then we have these kind of rather normal ideas as well in the context of IT standards. You need to have an open and non-discriminating access. Think about front agreements, right? All these kind of things echo here. So latecomers must also be able to access the standards and use the label, for example, on the similar terms of equal access. And then they introduce a market impact or a market share limit. So either the standard doesn't have a substantive significant increase in price or quality reduction, but if it increases the price substantially, then the market share needs to be under 90%, under 20%, sorry. So it's an either or. So either if you are increasing the price substantially, then you need to be at a low market share. If you have a high market share, but you're not increasing the price substantially, then or reducing quality substantially, then it's also fine if you comply with the other conditions. So I think that's wraps up what the EU and the Japanese write about their guidelines, and the Dutch had also something similar in their draft guidelines. I think what is also interesting is how we think about this. So I just said it doesn't have an effect on competition, right? In the EU and a lot of jurisdictions we think about, in the EU we call it object and effect. But in general it's about what kind of burden of proof do we apply. And on the object and effect situation, we have the UK, which says if we're having a sustainability, we need to be careful with an object classification if it is a sustainability agreement, because object infringements are typically price fixing, agreeing on the green product's price. So for example, these cases where you say, oh, we're going to charge a little surcharge, but it's a fixed surcharge for the fact that we have these green producers, green products. They sometimes happen, for example, in the recycling business. They say, oh, we're going to charge you 10% more, and it's going to be something like that. But it's a fixed surcharge, and that's one. Market and customer allocation are object restrictions, or limiting output, quality, and innovation. Agreeing not to use a cleaner tech would be, for example, an object restrictions. But all others, we typically go for effect analysis. The UK also highlights again the ancillary restraints, where they say, well, if you would have an agreement that is the agreement is not an object agreement, so it's not a price fixing agreement, but a sustainability agreement, it might still have clauses in there that look as object restrictions. And then we need to look whether they are necessary to implement the wider lawful sustainability agreement. Essentially, that's the classical ancillary restraints doctrine. They need to be proportionate to the achieving the goal. The key test is whether there's a way to achieve the same objective without that clause. The EU does something similar in their guidelines. They say, look, we can distinguish on the one hand object cases, which are disguised cartels, and genuine sustainability objective cases. So for object cases, object cases in general are those that are considered harmful by their very nature, and they are typically price fixing, market allocation, output limitation, innovation restrictions. If you don't have anything like that, but the main aim is to increase sustainability, then that creates reasonable doubt about whether the agreement is actually harmful to competition by its very nature, and the very nature is the important part here. And that means we need to have a closer look. We need to make an effects analysis. So for me, I think that's a very nice kind of distinction neatly, where you say object restrictions are the kind of disguised cartels, and the other ones are the genuine sustainability objectives. And for me, I would combine them. I would say disguised cartels are the object restrictions. Then you have genuine sustainability agreements where you can think about ancillary restraints and so on. Okay, so that's object effect. Then let's move on to balancing. And balancing, we first need to ask ourselves, what kind of balancing are we? I call this the abstract balancing, but I think it's the public interest balancing. It's the stuff that lawyers are really good at. Typically, we use some kind of proportionality assessment. On the one hand, competition, on the other hand, environment or whatever. You have public interest clauses in different competition laws, China, Hong Kong, Australia, also in Europe, in Spain. In Germany, you have it for mergers. For example, in Spain, the clause says in the merger rule that the minister can, for environmental reasons, override the decision by the competition authority. Maybe Wouters and Super League line of cases are also some kind of public interest cases for horizontal agreements. But it's always that a proportionality assessment is done. We say, on the one hand, you have this public interest, and on the other hand, you have competition, and you do some kind of balancing there. That's why I put the scale, the legal scale up there. And then we go to the other form of balancing, which is the more kind of economists-inspired measuring balancing, where we are looking within the consumer welfare framework to what extent does it fit. And I think, again, the common ground here is, well, sustainability is a quality parameter, but then it gets possibly slightly difficult if we need to investigate what about future benefits to consumers, what happens when the benefits happen in other markets, maybe we require them to be closely connected, these two markets where the benefits occur. And then what happens with future benefits in other markets, then you can talk about discount rates and so on. But I think that typically the really difficult questions are these ones. What do we do with benefits that occur outside the market of those affected? So essentially it's companies imposing their preferences on one group to the benefit of the other. My favorite example in this case is European companies who are producing shoes in Vietnam, and they just drop all the plastic packaging and waste that they do in the production of the shoes. They throw it over the factory, it lands in the water there and just flows down the river. If they now agree not to do that anymore, that will increase the prices for European consumers. But the benefits are mainly felt by the local population. They don't have such polluted rivers anymore. And how do we deal with that in competition law? Those are the tricky cases, but there are ways, and I'll quickly talk about them now. So what have we seen? We have seen there's a joint technical report, very visionary by the Greek and the Dutch Competition Authority, by economists done for them. The Dutch draft guidelines said we can look at contingent valuation, shadow prices. We can look at prices that other government agencies use, for example, the price of carbon. We can look to carbon markets. There are agencies that have calculated the value of life, and they say, like, okay, a person lives 1 year longer, what's the value? And we can use that. The Commission uses something else. They say, we're going to distinguish between essentially 3 different things: use benefits, non-use benefits, and collective societal benefits. And we can, to some extent, take them all into account. So use benefits are the ones that the consumer gets from using the good. That's the very kind of quality idea. But they say, well, look, there are these kind of qualities that are not directly related to when I use that. And those are the non-use benefits. So a classical example is behind my university in Hong Kong, we have a pathway that goes up the mountain through the forest, and it's beautiful. I have never used it, but I really appreciate the fact that it's there. And I would be willing, and that's the kind of question you can ask, would you be willing to pay for this? And how much would you be willing to pay for this? The fact that you have the opportunity to use this, or the fact that others have the opportunity to use this. You can also think about these non-use benefits in terms of the example that I made with the plastic pollution. Maybe I'm happy to pay a certain amount, maybe not all of it, but a certain sense for the fact that the river is not polluted in Vietnam. So that's one benefit. And then you have the third one, which are collective benefits. And those are basically benefits, the Commission's, or societal benefits, the Commission says they are independent of the personal valuation of consumers. So think about reductions in CO2. We all benefit from that, whether we like it or not. The Commission says we can take them into account, but not to the full extent. We cannot take all of the benefits into account, but we have to apportion them to the consumers affected. So that we basically would say, okay, we have a saving of X This is a saving for all the local population, let's say, of Sao Paulo. Those are all benefiting. But the consumers in Sao Paulo is only 100,000. So you would say, I think, what is it, 3 million? You would basically have the total value, you divide that by 3 million, and then multiply that by 100,000, which is the amount of users of the consumers. And they would say this is the small part of the benefit that still occurs to the people affected from the restriction of competition in the relevant market. And they say we can add that up to the benefits, the use benefits and the non-use benefits, and we all bring them together, and that basically identifies the benefits for the consumers in the relevant market. Okay, I'm looking at the time, but I think I'm rather good. So, and finally, I also deal in the book with process matters. And I think there my main point is that process matters. It's not just something, but it is important. And we can think about different things like agency objectives, enforcement priorities. It's not surprising that the French authority went after these cases. They could have had them just drop on the side and focused their enforcement elsewhere. Or the fact that the UK has adopted these guidelines, it was during the time that they adopted the guidelines, the green guidelines, it was an enforcement priority that they said climate change is important for our agency. Guidance. Guidelines can be formal guidelines or informal guidance and openness. The Dutch, the Japanese, the Singaporean, the UK, the EU, you can all now go in and say, look, I have this sustainability thing that I want to go to, and I'm not really 100% sure how to do that. And I'm thinking about this, is that okay? And then the competition authority says, well, if you maybe change it slightly, then it seems okay. Typically, this is informal, meaning it's not really 100% binding on the competition authority. They say, well, we're going to take into account if you have followed this in a good manner, but we reserve final judgment for later. The EU has done something very interesting in the AdBlue case, because they were concerned about the message that it sends out. In the AdBlue case, you remember that was this cartel case about the standards, where they then also said we're not going to compete anymore on making diesel exhaust fumes cleaner. And there the Commission said, we're going to fine you, but they issued at the same time a letter, and that letter said, look, the fining is one part, which is the cartel agreement. That is illegal. But the other parts that you've been doing here was perfectly legal and fine. The standardization is perfectly fine. And that was because the Commission was concerned about what message it sends out there and the legal certainty problems that it would get into for companies, and thereby kind of discouraging them from continuing to do standardization that improves sustainability and so on. You have, in some countries, approval proceedings, in public hearings, for example, in Australia. If you applied for a public policy exemption, you have public hearings where all the stakeholders get their word on a possibly restrictive agreement, and then there's a long discussion, first, second hearing, a very detailed thing. Greece has adopted a sandbox approach. If anyone works in finance, they do that more often, the financial regulators, where they basically say, look, you come here, you can play next to me, and that's why it's called sandbox, a bit like the kids, and under my supervision. You tell me what you do, and I'll come and occasionally look, and if someone comes, I'm sitting right here, they can directly complain to me and I tell you stop it. So that's the kind of sandbox idea. The Greeks have adopted it. They had, I think, 2 cases. I'm not sure how successful it is, but it's a one tool that you can certainly play around, and the question is always how do you measure success? It also depends if you look into the financial regulator. Sometimes it's used a lot, sometimes not so much. It depends a bit. So those are a couple of things. Then obviously you can talk about evidence, what kind of evidence you accept. Do you accept only qualitative evidence or quantitative evidence, or the other way around? Do you accept both? How are you going to assess them? Do you have the relevant expertise. I was talking with the competition authority in Hong Kong recently. It's a very small competition authority. I think they have 6 competition economists in total. And overall, it's a team of 70 people. And they said, look, if we would have to deal with a sustainability case, we would be getting together with the regulator. And that's what we just always do. We go and talk to the Environmental Protection Agency, and we set up maybe a joint working group to understand what impacts it has and so on. You can think about finding. So the Dutch, for example, have said, if you can show us that you have followed our guidelines or that you came to us and you adopted after a informal guidance the policy as we have discussed it, and then later it turns out that we find this illegal, that we're not going to fine you then. But it requires from you a kind of a will to follow this and not to basically cheat us. If you've cheated us, we're going to fine you. But if it is kind of a genuine following the law and then later turns out that it was illegal, then we're not going to fine you. International cooperation, I think, is also something you need to talk to other people and see how that's done. And I think in a certain way, that's also what the book tries to do, try to bring examples from all these kind of different jurisdictions together. Yes, that is essentially what we've talked about. We've talked about sustainability, why we should care about what it is, the economics, the core questions, and how can we think about this, and then we had a closer look at the sword and the shield and the process. And I think I'm very much on time. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Professor. It was a wonderful presentation and help us to think about Brazil and Brazilian questions. And I don't know if anyone here has any question. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. I am, while you were talking and speaking, I was thinking about, so there are some different process and goals when you talk about the relationship between competition and sustainability. And I think that you're saying there are the demand push initiatives and the supply push initiatives, and the demand ones, competition can make it works by themselves, unless if there are information enough for the consumers, right? But the point is that when there is a lack of competition, even in this situation, do you think that we should think about the connection between competition and sustainability would be not only thinking about the ex-post analysis, but also how when we preserve and protect competition, we also are making the markets more in a way of doing the changes and doing the efforts to go into a more sustainable way. And the other question is, sometimes I think that when we think about this relationship, we are looking into the capabilities of doing the investments and efforts that are necessary to sustainability, and also, but also to the incentives. So sometimes, we were talking about the mergers, right? The DuPont, Bio-Monsanto merger. They were thinking about the incentives, not pretty much about the capabilities. But sometimes in the merger, it could be necessary to think about how the merger affect the capabilities of doing the investment necessary for the sustainability force. So I would love to hear you about these two questions. Thank you so much.
So the first one, I think, is a focus on the ex ante. And the really interesting thing is, so I'm currently teaching a 5-day, that's why I'm here, a 5-day course on sustainability and competition law at FGV. And I have these kind of very excited students. And they had a similar question with the ex post. What is the role of the competition agency? And I think it depends always a bit on the national context. To what extent do you think the agency has a job in shaping markets, right? And I think there are slightly different things. So if you, and it's also a question about the tool. So think about the CMA, which has these market investigations, and after the market investigations, they can say, look, these are the things you need to change. If you have those tools, that's something different, I think, than if you are an agency that only does ex post analysis and maybe a bit of ex ante during a merger. But I think an agency that is more limited, if they wanted to do something about sustainability and they see something in a case where maybe on the demand side with the consumers things are not really working, then I would say it's not the job of the competition authority to correct for that what's not working in the market. But as I said, it depends a bit on the national context. But I think if that is the view of the competition authority, what is still a very important thing is to message and clearly write out what the problem is, right? So quite often in this debate we hear that it's not the job of the competition authority to do X, should be the legislator. Well, I always think that typically economists who, maybe I'm a bit mean, but they forget how much jobs legislators have. And I think they have so much laws to think about. And we should actually be happy that they do not regulate everything that we think is going wrong. But maybe sometimes it's about shining a light. And if a competition authority shines a light in a decision and says, we would like to do something, but there is a problem here with the consumers because, for example, they don't have the information. And I can tell you my favorite example in Hong Kong is, which I have never experienced before. I'm not sure how it works in Brazil. But I go to a supermarket, I wanted to buy oats. And they had, I think, there were at least 30 different forms of oats, breakfast oats. The problem was they were from the States, from Australia, from Europe, even from China, obviously from China. But they were sold in 500, 300 gram packages, 26 ounces, 48 ounces, and they all had just one price there. They didn't have a comparative pricing there. Like in Europe, we have 100 grams is this and that. And if a competition authority sees that, then they can say, look, this is in their decision. This is something where we would need some regulation. And if a competition authority says something like that, I think that makes already quite a, because it shines a light and gives also civil society then an argument saying, look, we need to do something here. So I think that's a bit of on the ex ante. The other one is the capabilities. I do think that is definitely something we should think about. And maybe there's a certain overlap with what I call the innovation diversity, right? What capabilities do you have? And that might be something to take more serious. But I do think our current systems, nearly in all competition laws, can deal with this. It just requires a bit of will to think about those things and say, okay, how is this going to turn out? And I think all the tools that we have on whether it's research and development guidelines on how we treat research and development in merger regulation, we can all think about capabilities and whether that merger will make it easier, provide capabilities more or not. I think that's should be able to do that.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for this lecture. And I think it was very, very insightful for us all. And I would like to address to make you two questions. regarding the balancing perspective. As you said, there is some controversial issues in balancing. There are some very controversial issues in balancing, but I would like to hear from you if you believe that assessing and making these balancing exercises through a more orthodox approach under the lens of efficiency analysis, is that really feasible for competition authorities to do that? You have touched upon some methodologies that could be used, but at the end of the day, I am a little bit skeptical about if it would lead us to a conclusion that there are efficiencies, because mainly when we are talking about jurisdictions that require those efficiencies to be passed on consumers, such as the EU guidelines. So when we are not talking about out-of-market efficiencies, but efficiencies that must be passed on to consumers, when we look to over the last 10 years, I could not recall any competition authority that has approved it, that has cleared a merger on the basis of efficiencies. So my question is that really feasible to go this way, or at the end of the day, we will not find any sustainability agreement that would reach this high threshold for proving efficiencies under a more economic approach?
I think that's a very good question, and I think there are 2 points that I can make in this regard. First, a very bad and bland answer. I'm not working in a competition authority, so I can't tell you whether that is possible or not. I think as academics, we provide you the tools. To what extent you can use them. Maybe if you want to use environmental economics, I was just sitting next to the deputy chief economist of DG Comp, who says he was he was just a normal economist, and at the beginning he found it very difficult. But in the end of the day, he says it's all economics. We can do it. It's just that we need to put our thinking caps on, sit down, look at the methods, and then maybe call a friend or what who has gives a bit of a helping hand. So it's about applying them. So yes or no, but I think in a sense it also has to do, and I have a different, it's not in the book, but I have just finished a paper on developing countries and competition, and I think capabilities is really important there, right? Sometimes there are just limits on what you can do. So, and it depends then on the agency, what capabilities the agency has. So that's the kind of sad part of the news. I think the positive side of the thing, I don't know whether it's in the Commission guidelines or was it in a draft, or whether it was something that they said. There's this passage that I have very clearly in my head, and I still see it in front of my eyes, which basically says, most of the times, it's not that we are having these kind of very detailed assessments. Most of the times, we are talking about, and we don't need to do a detailed assessment, these efficiencies, the improvement in sustainability and so on, is most of the times very clear. You do a back-of-the-envelope calculations, and it's by an order of magnitude higher than the price increase. If you want to look into how you can do that with the willingness to pay, and the Dutch Competition Authority, in a case that is sometimes criticized by people that working in the space of sustainability and competition, or the Dutch chicken of tomorrow case, right? It's not I say it's not a sustainability case because it's about chicken welfare. That's something different. But the tools that they have used, we can also use in that context. And I think so that shows you that at least the Dutch Competition Authority could do it. But I think in the majority of cases, it's most of the times a magnitude matter, and then we don't need to do the detailed assessment, if that helps.
I don't know if anyone in Zoom has a question. Se quiserem, podem fazer no chat e a gente olha aqui. I don't think so. So thank you a lot.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot online and for here. It's like I'm very honored to have so many people here. It's so many people I can see here online. Thanks so much. Thanks. And one more thing. The book is going to be available open access.